Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project. Our program today is Our Delicate Rights, Japanese American Incarceration, and it's being presented by Jeffrey Urban from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a partnership between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we put on every year from January through April. Just a few quick reminders: by participating today, you are going to be recorded and archived. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that teachers and students can access them later. We're excited to have you. We have a good group today from all over the US, and we want you to participate as much as possible. So if you haven't already, look for your chat box. It looks like a little caption bubble. We will use that a lot to interact today. If you need help renaming yourself to your school or to just how you'd like to be called on, let me know in the chat and I can help you with that. If you'd like to be on camera, we can make that happen too. Again, just leave me a note in the chat. And then just be really respectful of all of our tools. We want to make sure that any comments we're sharing or questions we're asking are directly related to what our presenter is speaking about. And we just want to thank you again. This is our website if you're looking for our upcoming programs to attend, or if you're looking for the information about where to find our recordings. You can find all that there. And it looks like we have people from Maryland, from New York, from Idaho, so all over. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and give it to the person you came to see. Jeff, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Hey, welcome everybody from all over the place. And those of you that are digging out from severe weather, I am with you. We've had a pretty mild winter here so far, but we've had our ice and snowstorms here in the Hudson Valley ourselves. So I feel for you and I understand what you're going through. So I am Jeff Urban. I'm at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. We are the nation's very first presidential library and the only presidential library that was ever used by a president while they were actually president. So FDR built his presidential library toward the end of his second term and then decided to run for a third term. So he was able to use it all throughout his third term and also the 83 days of his fourth term. He died just 83 days into his fourth term. And the material I'm going to be sharing with you today is coming from our archive. Our presidential archive has 17.5 million pages of documents in it, which would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stack them all on top of each other. So if you're looking for primary source information about the Roosevelt administration or the Roosevelt era, the Roosevelt Presidential Library is the place to turn. And as I say, we're going to be drawing from that material here today. Now, today our topic is Japanese American incarceration. And for many, many years, it was called Japanese American internment. But in recent years, there's been a sort of a name change, and the name change reflects the fact that the term incarceration is really not technically correct. Internment and incarceration are actually legal terms, and the idea of incarceration, internment means that you have, gone through a legal process, and of course these guys have not done that. These folks that were, rounded up and moved away from their homes. So Japanese American incarceration is probably a better term for what actually happened to the 120,000 folks that lived out there. Now, certainly, you could think, well, gee, why are we talking words when we're talking about what happened to people, right? But words are important. Okay, words are very important. And the topic that we're talking about today is this idea of Japanese American incarceration. And it is clearly one of the biggest blemishes on the Roosevelt presidential record, right? There's no mistaking about it. There's no, candy coating it. There's no pussyfooting around, right? There's no way around it. This was clearly one of the biggest blemishes on the Roosevelt record. And, we look back now and we say, oh, FDR was a great president. He did a lot of great stuff, getting us through the Great Depression, getting us through the World War, helping to create the United Nations and all that. Yes, he did all of those things, but the Japanese American incarceration is part of that as well. So what I would like to do today is to talk to all of you about the Japanese American incarceration and give you some background about what led up to it and how it occurred, give you some background about what was going on in Washington at the time, give you some background as to what folks actually experienced as they went through this time in American history, and then draw some conclusions from that we can use and think about today. I want to be very clear. I am not apologizing for what the president did. I'm not apologizing for this because clearly, there is no there's no way to apologize for it, right? It was clearly something that should not have been done, and it was done in the context of its time. And so when I say I'm not apologizing, what I mean is I'm not making excuses for what FDR, did. I'm not making excuses. It's going to sound like I'm defending this, but I'm simply presenting what was going on in the minds of folks at the time that these things were happening. So that's what we are looking to do. So let me tighten this up a little bit if I can here, and we'll get started. Whoops, that's not what I want. I think I want this. There we are. Okay, so in order to understand what happened with the Japanese American incarceration, you have to take a step back by about at least 2 months, because to fully understand what happened and what occurred with this time in American history, you really have to understand the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. Now, usually when we look at the Japanese American incarceration, we look at it as an isolated event, and it's not an isolated event. Okay, it's actually something that was a reaction to the attack at Pearl Harbor. So let's take a little look at that. The United States suffered an incredible attack at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. It was a shock to the country. It was a shock to the world. And it was a surprise, right? We were not expecting this attack. Now, we knew we were having trouble with the Japanese. We knew there could be problems, but the size, the scope, and the ambition of the attack was beyond anything we could have comprehended at the time. In fact, the Japanese diplomats had been in the White House talking with the president and members of the State Department right up until that Friday before the attack at Pearl Harbor. And the United States had built Pearl Harbor as this big base. It was a large military base that consisted of the United States Army and also the United States Navy. And the idea here was to build up this big base out in the Pacific Ocean and then use that base to sort of project power into the Pacific Rim. So let me give you an example, right? It's kind of like when you guys are at school and, you're goofing around at lunch, hey, and then the lunch lady walks by and all of a sudden, you start, eating your pudding the way you're supposed to and being all nice and everything because the lunch lady's right there, right? Well, Pearl Harbor, the base of Pearl Harbor was kind of like the lunch lady. The idea was to put this big authoritative force out there in the Pacific to project power into the Pacific Rim and have the Japanese think about what it was that they were doing. And the idea being, hey, you know what, we can take you if we, take you on if we need to. And the Japanese, of course, saw this and they read it the other way. They said, okay, well, if the space is getting bigger and bigger and the Americans are using this to project power out here, then if this space gets bigger and bigger, then it's going to get stronger and stronger. And it's going to get to a point where we will have to do whatever the United States says. And so they decided, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to take this base out ahead of time, and we are going to, do that with a surprise attack. It was on a Sunday morning, when everybody, was sleeping in. It was a beautiful Sunday morning, no warning whatsoever, and along comes the attack. And in a little more than 3 hours, over 2,000 people were killed in this attack. Okay, so this was a huge shock. I can't underscore enough how surprised we were and how shocked we were at this. Meanwhile, the other things that are going on in the world at that time, the Nazis have taken over Europe. France has been defeated and has fallen under Nazi control. The Nazis have got control over almost all of Europe. What they don't have occupied, they have surrounded, so they're able to control it that way as well. England was barely hanging on to to independence there. In the north of Africa, Italy, Nazi Germany's ally, had taken over the northern part of Africa, and out in the Pacific Rim, the Japanese were moving into China and Manchuria and other places there as well. So the world was really in tough shape, right? And this is the context that was going on, in the minds of folks in Washington and such. And the fact that the Japanese diplomats had been negotiating with us to try to get the tensions down between the United States and Japan led us even more into a false sense of security. Now, what happened was the Japanese military decided to go ahead with the attack at Pearl Harbor, but they didn't tell the Japanese diplomats. So the Japanese diplomats were in Washington talking with the president, and they were being told, hey, from headquarters in Tokyo, hey, go and, try to calm things down with the United States. And that's exactly what they were doing. But they themselves had been tricked by their own military, who had already decided to go ahead and make the attack. Now, the Pearl Harbor base, as I said, was the largest base outside of the United States. And the United States was ranked somewhere between 14th and 17th behind Portugal on the morning of the attack on December 7th, 1941, in terms of military strength. So we had let our defenses sort of, wither between the First World War and the Second World War, and now we're building up this base out there as well. And we put basically all of our eggs in one basket. And when the Japanese came in and they attacked, they basically took out that base. And that the idea of it was to knock the United States out of the Pacific Rim for at least a year. Luckily, we had aircraft carriers that had not been at the base, and so we were able to get back into the fight within 6 months or so. And so, that's why we were able to, make up that lost ground and such. Now you think, well, gee, I thought we were talking about Japanese-American incarceration. Why are you talking so much about the attack at Pearl Harbor? I'm talking about the attack at Pearl Harbor because it was done by the nation of Japan. And once that attack occurred, there was this anti-Japanese hysteria here in the United States. And the United States had been caught off guard, right? We thought we had everything under control, building up this big base out there, projecting power out. And then when we weren't expecting it, and we looked the other way, bingo, the Japanese military attacked. Now, also going on at this time, there was a lot of anti-Asian feelings, particularly on the west coast of the United States. So what had happened was many people from Asia had come to California, and they had laid down roots, and they had started families, and they had started businesses. And what ended up happening was a lot of the folks that were already there were kind of getting resentful of this. Like, who's these guys moving in here and coming in and starting businesses and competing with us and all of that sort of stuff. And there was this idea that they were doing better than a lot of the folks that were in the area already. So many folks from Asia, particularly Japan, came to the West Coast, got into businesses such as trucking, citrus, and shipping. Those were the three big industries that the Japanese Americans had gotten into. And there was some resentment, right? You know, so it's kind of like you're trying out for the basketball team, and then some new kid comes in from another school, and bingo, he's put right on the basketball team. And you're like, wait a minute, I've been here like, you know, for 3 years trying to get on this basketball team. This guy comes in, and all of a sudden he's on the basketball team, and I'm not, right? So that was where some of this resentment and things had come from. And a lot of this resentment was being stirred up by the politicians out there on the West Coast to gain support. So very often what some people will do is they start to blame other people, right? Well, you're not doing so well. Well, you want to know why? Because it's from that other guy, right? It's them. They're the ones. They're the ones that are calling the shots. They're the ones that are creating the problem. And I will help you stand up to them. And that only reinforces this resentment and such. I see a question in the chat. Why would the military lie to their diplomats? Well, the military lied to their diplomats because they wanted to put up that illusion with the United States that everything was going fine and that we were working to calm down aggression, when in fact, they weren't, right? The military was about to attack us. So they used their own diplomats to try to lull us into a false sense of security. So you've got this natural resentment on the West Coast, and you also have these politicians who are beginning to sort of drum up anti-Asian sentiment. And this is a really bad mix, okay? Because now what these politicians are saying is, hey, you know what? Look at this. Look what they did at Pearl Harbor, and they're living right here among us. You know, can we trust them? Do we know what's going on? Okay, and this is, by the way, a form of prejudice, right? Us and them, right? Making us versus them, that sort of thing. So this is not a good thing. In fact, there was a politician by the name of Earl Warren, who was the California State Attorney General, who was sort of in the lead on some of this stuff, sort of building up this, hey, it's us against them, and you know, here they are doing this stuff. And Earl Warren later becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court later on in his career. And he becomes a very liberal Supreme Court justice. And some people say, well, you know, he sort of turned into a liberal because he had been so conservative and mean to the Japanese Americans back at that time. And so, you know, he kind of like had a change of heart as he went through. Now, this is what happens. We get attacked at Pearl Harbor. There's this whole world falling apart. We've got this anti-Asian sentiment building up on the West Coast. The politicians on the West Coast are, you know, sort of feeding this frenzy and everything. And now the pressure is on President Roosevelt to do something, right? Do something. There was a public outcry. Hey, these guys, right? These Japanese just attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, I want to be very, very clear about this. The Japanese Americans that were living on the West Coast are not the folks that attacked Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Americans that were living on the West Coast were Americans. They happened to have Japanese ancestry, right? Grandmas, grandpas, parents and stuff that had come from Japan, but we're talking about two separate individual groups of people. But in the minds of these folks that were anti-Japanese, it didn't matter, right? It didn't matter. So there's public pressure on the president to do something. And in the 10 weeks following the attack at Pearl Harbor, there is a big debate that goes on in Washington, D.C. Okay, the big debate that goes on in Washington, D.C. And the Secretary of War, Secretary Stimson, says something has to be done, right? We've got to do something. You know, we've got to deal with these folks that are living here, because look what happened at Pearl Harbor. Now, the military did not want to be caught in a position like they were in Pearl Harbor a second time, right? So they were very, very sensitive. So they were very sensitive of the fact that, look, we were caught by surprise the first time. We don't want that to happen again. We're going to take extra super measures to prevent that doesn't happen again. So that was what was the War Department. Like, look, we've already been tricked once. We can't be tricked again. Secretary of Justice, the Attorney General Biddle, said there's nothing we can do, right? We can't do anything to these folks because the folks that are on the West Coast are not the people that were flying the planes. They are not the people that were attacking us. These, in many cases, are American citizens. So they haven't created a crime, right? They haven't done anything. The FBI, the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, he said, hey, we're cool. We don't have to do anything. We've already got it taken care of. And I want to share some documents with you. So this is a document. It's from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI. And he says he's writing this letter to one of FDR's aides. He said, I thought it would be of interest to the president and to you to have the enclosed charts before you, which show the number of Japanese, German, and Italian aliens taken into custody by the FBI as of December 9th. This gives the exact location and numbers apprehended and places at which they were apprehended. So let me focus in on this a little bit, and I'll show you. This is a very interesting series of documents here. All right, and I think I remember my coding here. Okay, here we go. Let's go up just a little bit. Oops. All right, so this is going to be a little hard to see here. Okay, but I don't know if you, okay, so there's J. Edgar Hoover's signature, right? And he's sending this to a guy by the name of General Watson, who was one of FDR's advisors. And he sends this, and it is from the FBI. It's got the letterhead up here, and the emblem and the symbol. And what Hoover is basically saying to this, to the president is, hey, don't worry, you guys, I've already got all the troublemakers under control, right? You know how like in your school or your town, there's like that one sort of group that's always troublemaking, right? That one family or that one guy that's always getting into trouble, or that one gal, right? And so the minute something goes down, everybody goes, oh, it must have been Brian. Brian's always causing trouble, right? Well, Hoover had been keeping an eye on those people that he considered to be that Brian, right? And so he had already been keeping track of these guys. And the minute something went down, like the attack at Pearl Harbor, he went out and he arrested those troublemaking folks, or those folks that he suspected of causing trouble. So what this shows you here is that 1,212 Japanese aliens were taken into custody by the FBI by 7:30 a.m. on December 9th, 1941. Okay, and so what Hoover basically said was, look, I already know all the troublemakers, and I've already got them already in jail. There's no reason to take anybody else out. I've got the folks that we need to have in custody. So he took 1,200 Japanese. He arrested 620 Germans, right? In these locations, this is the FBI. He's arresting these guys, and he took into custody 98 Italian Americans. Now, what this shows you is, okay, his biggest target, of course, were the Japanese Americans. And part of the reason for this is pure and simple racism, right? These folks were easily more identifiable. Japan had directly attacked the United States of America, as opposed to Germany and Italy, who were Japan's allies, but they hadn't really officially attacked us. And so Hoover says, we got everything under control. The military is saying we've got to do something. The State Department is saying, well, we don't really know what's going on, right? These guys are not really Japanese folks. They're American citizens. And, they didn't know what to do, right? There's never been a situation like that before. So basically what happened was the president's sitting in the middle of this debate. He's got justice saying we can't do anything because they haven't done a crime. He's got the FBI saying, don't worry about it. I've already got it all solved and figured out. He's got the State Department that's saying, we don't really know what to do. I mean, these guys were telling us everything was going to be cool when they were talking to the president in the White House, and then they go and they attack us. They were completely confused as to what was going on. And you've got the military saying, no, we have to get these guys rounded up because of what had occurred. And so what happened was the president is looking at all these crosswinds and all these ideas and all these suggestions, and he decides to make a compromise move. And what he does is he compromises with an executive order, which is this executive order right here. Why my cue is constantly a little bit too low here. Sorry about that. So this is Executive Order 9066. And if you were to read this executive order, and you can get these documents, by the way, by going to our website and going to our For Teachers section and go to curriculum guides, and you can download all these documents. But this is Executive Order 9066. And if you read this executive order, which was put out by President Roosevelt in late February of 1942, well, and there's his signature down there at the bottom. What this basically says is that the United States military, he's giving the United States military the power and the right to create exclusion zones. Okay, that's the words he uses in here, this idea of exclusion zones. So the president never says, oh, go round up, Japanese Americans. He gives the military the ability to create exclusion zones. Now, in the mind of the president, an exclusion zone is someplace like an airport, someplace like a seaport, someplace like a communication center, someplace like a anything like a reservoir, anything that might be important to the military and the security of the United States. They can exclude people from that. But what the military does is they take this executive order, they read it, and they say, wait a minute, so you telling us we can create an exclusion zone? Yes. And we can keep people out of the exclusion zone? Yes. Okay, the military says, we're going to create an exclusion zone, and we only need actually two of them. One of them is going to be the entire west coast of the United States, and the other part is going to be part of the southern part of the United States. So we are going to create two exclusion zones, one the entire west coast, the other part of the southern part of the United States, and we are going to have people removed from those areas. And the people we are going to remove from those areas are the Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So President Roosevelt never actually says, go round these guys up. He says, listen, military, we got a big problem on our hands, right? We've just been attacked. Things are going on here. I don't know, exactly what's going on just yet. It's only 2 months into the war. So if you need to keep people out of certain places, go right ahead and do it. And that's what Executive Order 9066 does. But the military runs with it. And this is what's called an unintended consequence, which happens sometimes with laws, excuse me, and activities of organizations in government. And what the military does is it says, okay, this is an exclusion zone and this is an exclusion zone. And what ended up happening was this. It led to people being rounded up, Japanese Americans, people of Japanese ancestry. Thank you, Therese, for putting that on there in the chat. And basically what it said was, listen, you guys, you got to get out of here because we got this executive order and you are going. So what the military did was it went around, it put up posters like this, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, and it gave them anywhere from 48 hours to a week to get out of their homes, which means that these folks had to sell their homes, they had to get rid of all their possessions, they had to get rid of their pets, they had to sell their businesses, they had to wrap up everything and move out and be loaded up with these into these camps, right? And you could bring one bundle of stuff with you, okay? And here you see some folks that are waiting to be put into the camp. Now, sometimes they were taken out of there in trucks, okay? And this is pretty shocking when you think about this, right? Imagine yourself, you're sitting there and, wherever your ancestors are from has a problem with the United States. And now the government comes in and says, hey, we got a problem with the country that your ancestors came from. So we're rounding you up and, tossing you in the back of trucks, tossing you into the back of, on trains and things and hauling you out to these places. And people that were young people that were old were taken out and to put in these camps. Here's an older gentleman, right? Clearly, this guy is probably not a threat to the United States, right? He's got to be helped off a train. He's got a cane, right? And hey, but guess what? You're of Japanese ancestry, and we are excluding you from the West Coast. Now, these folks were put into camps, and the camps were huge, right? 120,000 people were removed from their homes and placed into these camps. And these camps were basically, they were housed in barracks, okay, which are just buildings that are made out of plywood and tar paper, which is a type of waterproof paper. And inside of these barracks, there are no walls. So the average family got about 12 feet by 20 feet, and then the next family would be in there and 12 by 20 feet, and then the next family 12 by 20 feet. And the rooms were divided with clothesline and blankets hanging between each section. Okay, so look at this. It goes on as far as the eye can see, right? And you'll notice there's no trees, there's no shrubbery, right? This is not, a great place to end up, living. And here are some folks that are being brought in by truck. And you'll notice that there's a fence over here. So this is an old fairground, right? Because they needed space to do this really in a quick hurry. They did it like in parks, they did it in old fairgrounds, and they put them out in the desert, and they just built these plywood barracks really quick. And they were very simple. They had some water, some electricity, but very, very plain, very, very simple. And, folks could bring their bundle and move in there as they, were brought to the camp. Now, I want to show you one more picture, and then we'll go to a little discussion if we'd like. Here is a picture that I think says a lot about what was going on at that time. So this is a group of Japanese Americans, and they're being loaded onto a train to go off to one of these camps. Notice that they're dressed really nice, right? These folks are dressed like they're going to church or to a wedding or something, right? Dressed to the nines. And that was because these folks had a lot of dignity, right? They were saying, hey, you can take us out of our house, but you can't, when you do take us out of our house, we're going to be looking nice, right? We're going to, we're going to be looking good when we do it, right? We're going to go, but we're going to go, on our own, with our own dignity and such. So here you have these folks, and if you look closely, it's mostly women, children, little old men, okay? And then look at this. In this picture, there are no less than 14 soldiers lined up here to get these people onto the train. Doesn't that strike you as maybe a little bit of overkill, right? Do you really need 14 guys just in this picture to get these people who are all calm and quiet and dressed nice and, getting ready to get onto the train? Don't you think that might be a little bit of overkill in terms of power? Well, this is how nervous that the military was. They weren't taking any chances, right? These guys step out of line, we will have overwhelming manpower there to do it. Now, remember a few minutes ago, I said the United States was ranked somewhere between 14th and 17th behind Portugal in military strength. Well, this picture shows that. Look at the helmets these guys are wearing. Okay, these guys are wearing World War I Army helmets, right? These are the Army helmets that the doughboys wore in the First World War 25 years before this picture was taken. We were so far behind in our military strength that we were still using equipment from a quarter of a century ago, from the very First World War. And that'll give you an idea of just how nervous we were about this. Now, some folks said, hey, we can't be doing this. This isn't right. And one of those people was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt said, listen, Eleanor, love you. You're my wife, right? You're the first lady, but we have to speak on a unified front on this. I cannot have you telling people this is wrong, talking out about this being wrong. I've got a two-front war in my hands. I'm fighting in Europe, I'm fighting in Asia, And, this is something I needed to do. The military took it a little extreme, but hey, I've got other fish I got to fry right now. You cannot talk about this in public. And Mrs. Roosevelt said, okay, I won't. And she didn't, but that didn't stop her from working behind the scenes. So here she is visiting a camp, and she's meeting with young Japanese American students. And she's basically telling them, listen, we haven't forgotten you. We understand what you're going through here. This is not a good thing, but, it's necessary for, American security. And so I haven't forgotten you. I'm here to visit you, and I'm here to let you know that I'm helping you out. Now, if there were young women or young men that were, let's say, just about getting ready to go to college, Mrs. Roosevelt worked to get those kids out of the camps and into colleges on the East Coast, where there was less anti-Asian sentiment along the way. And the folks that lived in the camps made the best of it. So here is, and this, these are not good conditions, but here is a picture of a teacher, and she is standing outside of a school, and the kids are lining up to go into school. So within the camps, the Japanese Americans sort of created their own communities. And they said, all right, you know what, we're not going to be in here forever. So these kids are going to have to learn. The kids were allowed to do things like play baseball and goof around. Here's two buddies, goofing around at the camp. Okay, and again, it's not where they were in their old neighborhood, but they're having some fun there. And even within the camps, they organized themselves. Here is a picture of a concert that's being given. So if you were in the camp and you knew how to play a musical instrument, they organized themselves into orchestras, and they're giving a concert for their fellow folks in the camp, and they're doing it underneath the American flag. Right. Most of the folks that went to these camps, if not willingly. They said, hey, you know what? The government says that we need to do this, and that this is an important thing for us to do to, keep the country safe. We don't like it, but we'll do it. And so that's what ended up happening along the way. It's also worth noting that places like Canada and countries in South America also, took Japanese folks of Japanese ancestry into custody and put them in camps too. I'm not saying that two wrongs make a right, but what I'm saying is that this was sort of a widespread thought and a widespread belief. Now, at one point, the young men in the camps were offered the opportunity to get out. If they wanted to get out of the camps, they could go into the army and fight for our country, but they had to take loyalty oaths. And so here is a group of Japanese American young men, and they're taking loyalty oaths. And some of this was kind of controversial because, why should these guys have to take a loyalty oath when I've never taken a loyalty oath? Have you ever taken a loyalty oath? Right? So the idea here was, if you take a loyalty oath to the country, to the United States, then, we'll let you in to the military. And a lot of the guys resented that. It's like, well, why should I have to do that when most other folks don't have to do that, right? When you're a baby and you're born, they don't, put you in your cradle and say, okay, little baby, make a loyalty oath to the United States, right? But these guys were asked to do that. Some of them refused. And the minute you refused, oh, so you're not loyal to the United States, eh? Then you can stay right here in the camp. But those that did get out went into the army. And here we see a picture of a Japanese American soldier. And these guys fought primarily in the Mediterranean area, in and around Italy. And these guys fought very tough, very hard for their country because they were Americans, right? They happened to have Japanese ancestry, but they were Americans as they fought their way through. So this is what happened with the Japanese American internment. It resulted as a direct result of the attack at Pearl Harbor. And the president was in this crossroads of ideas of what should we do about these folks that were on the West Coast. The politicians on the West Coast were drumming up hatred against them, and the military was pushing to do something. The State Department didn't know what to do. The Justice Department says there's nothing we can do because they're not the ones that created the crime. And the president was like, okay, I've got to do something. I will create an executive order that will allow exclusion zones. Here you go, military. And the military said, ooh, exclusion zones, huh? All right, we'll make 2 of them, and we will put them on the entire West Coast and the bottom part of the United States. It resulted in 120,000 Japanese Americans being moved from their homes and being put into these camps. Most of the folks remained there for, on average, about 3 years. And conditions in the camps got better as time went on. But still, they had to leave their homes, right? They had to leave their businesses. And when the war was over and these folks were free to go, most of them decided not to go back to the West Coast. They decided to go to other parts of the country because they didn't want to go back to these places that had treated them so badly and that had been so resentful and such. So this is an important lesson for us to learn quite a few things here. Number one is that, there are things called unintended consequences. So sometimes, there'll be a rule or a law or, something will come about, and from that will come something that nobody thought about. And that's what happened with this. Now you say, well, why didn't the president just go ahead and say, well, oops, that's not what I meant. Let's do something else. Well, it's because he was fighting Hitler in Europe. He was fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. We were 17-14 behind Portugal in military power. We were just coming through a Great Depression, and Hitler had taken all over Europe, and the Italians had all over North Africa. And we had a lot of catching up to do. So this was seen as one of many pieces of things that the president had to had to do. Now, Roosevelt Elementary, hey, Roosevelt Elementary School, woohoo! You guys are asking, why would they fight for a country imprisoning them? Well, that's a great question. That is a really great question. And the reason they did that was because they were loyal Americans. See, that's the whole point. These guys weren't bad guys. These were regular folks like you and like me. But they got caught up in this thing, and they were being sort of punished for the actions of somebody else. Okay, think about this. This might be something that you guys can relate to. Have you ever had a situation in class where there's 1 or 2 guys or gals and they're goofing around in class, right? And they're causing trouble, and maybe they make a paper airplane and they throw it and it hits the teacher in the back of the head, and the teacher turns around and says, all right, I want to know who threw that plane. Who threw it, right? And everybody's like, ooh, I don't want to, nobody wants to rat anybody out, right? So then your teacher says, okay, well, guess what? We're not going to go out for recess now because I don't know who threw that plane, and I'm not going to stand up here and get hit by paper airplanes. So nobody is going out for recess. So what this is a situation where everybody in the class is being punished for the actions of that 1 or 2 goofball kids that threw the plane, right? That's exactly what happened with the Japanese Americans. And you remember how sad you felt and how, hurt you felt and how unfair that felt to you. That's how it felt with a lot of the Japanese Americans as well. But these folks were loyal American citizens, and they said, well, we don't like it, but we'll take it because that's what our government thinks that we need to do. Now, these guys, it took all the way from the 1940s all the way on up to President Reagan in the 1980s. So it took almost 40 years for the government to say, yikes, that wasn't a good thing to do, right? We're sorry. And President Reagan issued an apology to the Japanese Americans who had been in the camps, and the Congress voted to allow each person that was in the camps $20,000. They got a check for $20,000 as a sort of a consolation prize or whatever. But by that point, 40 years had gone by. By that point, your businesses were gone, your homes were gone, those sorts of things. Someone says, did FDR ever express remorse for the decision? Well, not entirely and not directly. I think he knew that it was not a good thing, but and he saw how it was being implemented, but he just had so many other things on his plate that he never really was able to get back to that. He may have, had he lived, but of course he died in office. Let's see, we had assigned seating for all fifth grade because of a few misbehaving students. Yeah, see, that's what we're talking about. So it only takes a few folks to create a problem for everybody else. But here are some themes I want to keep you, let you guys think about. There's this theme of unintended consequences, right? Sometimes we do things and other things happen that we hadn't planned on or that we hadn't thought about. So we have to be very careful about that. The other thing we have to be very careful about is just how delicate our rights are, okay? We have civil rights in this country. They are guaranteed by the Constitution, and they are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. But what happens sometimes is in national emergencies, people get so worried, people get so riled up, people get so afraid that they take action before they think things through. And this is what happened with the Japanese Americans during the Second World War. We were so upset and so caught off guard by the attack at Pearl Harbor that we overreacted. And so what we have to understand is that when we find ourselves in national crisis, when we find ourselves in national situations where nobody really knows what's going on just yet, we have to be very careful about not overdoing it and not going too far in what we end up doing to try to solve that situation. Were they given the same treatment that we were given? Were they given the same treatment that we were given? I'm not quite sure. Oh, I'm sorry. I must be building here. Let's see. Is it true there were no spies for Japan found on U.S. soil? That is true. There was no proven, because what we were with the guys on the West Coast were, their justification was, oh, if these guys are spies, or these guys might be saboteurs, they might be working with the Japanese over there in Japan, but there was never any proven case of sabotage or espionage or that sort of stuff from any Japanese Americans in the United States. So it was really a big overreaction, and we have to be careful about that. Our rights, boys and girls, our rights are very, very delicate, and they're very, very fragile. So we have to make sure that we protect our rights, and we have to make sure that we stand up for other people when their rights are not being protected. Did Japan regret Pearl Harbor? Yes, they did. They almost regretted it the minute that they did it, because what it did was there had been up to that point, people were worried about Japan, but some people were like, look, let's just mind our own business. We don't want to get involved. Other people were like, well, we got to get into this war and make things happen. So there was a big debate back and forth. Do we get into the war or do we stay out of the war? What should we do? Back and forth, back and forth. Once the attack occurred at Pearl Harbor, most folks were like, yeah, we got to get these guys. And so it galvanized American support against the Japanese and behind the war. And the Japanese said they felt like they had awoken a sleeping giant, right? So you don't want to do that, because then that giant is mad and he's coming after you, okay? Let's see here. One spy. Yeah, there were some spies at Pearl Harbor, on the Pearl Harbor base. That's true. But on the continental United States, there was never any proven espionage or sabotage. Let's see, feel free to put, oh, there's at the end of the war. At the end of the war, they could leave the camps. Yep, and they were on their way out. Let's see here. Oh, the question is, were the Japanese Americans given back all their rights after the camps? Yeah, after the camps, it's like, oh, okay, sorry, you guys are free to go. Go ahead, oops, we didn't, everything's good. See you. Go start off with your rest of your lives again. But how do you do that when you've lost so much, right? How do you do that when you spend 3 years in a camp? How do you do that when you've lost your business, your home, much of your property, right? It's really, really hard to do. But once the war was over, everybody was just so glad to be done with the war and so glad to be done with the Nazis that everybody just sort of got caught up in their own lives. And these 120,000 people were kind of forgotten until the 1980s. Let's see, why didn't the US government intervene and make certain that their properties and businesses were returned to them? Well, again, there was just so much going on, and I'm not making an excuse, but this is just the explanation. There was so much going on at the time. Don't forget the government, had very little resources. We were still coming out of the Great Depression. Now we were fighting on a world war. And so it was like, look, this was just one thing among lots of different things that were going on, at that time. It's kind of like, have you ever been going on a field trip, right? And I don't mean to, when I give this example, I don't mean to in any way take away from what the Japanese Americans went through. But let's say there's a field trip, right? And there's 120 kids and they're getting ready to get on the bus, and the teacher's counting everybody up, and you can't find your lunch. So you say, Mrs. McGillicuddy, I can't find my lunch. All right, well, we'll see if we can find it later. One time, and they're counting the kids and all that. And the idea is there's so much else going on that one or two little people kind of get caught in the mix. And it's a terrible, terrible thing when that happens, but that is what happened. And, again, I'm just making the explanation. I'm not making an excuse. What happened to the camps? The camps were mostly taken down. There are a couple that have been preserved as, learning centers and sites where you can go and see what was going on. How are they supposed to buy something that they still have bank accounts? Well, they had small bank accounts. As I said, in the camps, they tried to create, they created their own little, basically communities and such. So a lot of times what they did was they bartered things. Because what these guys would do is they would create gardens and things outside of their barracks. So if I'm growing tomatoes and you've got really nice carrots growing in your garden, I'll trade you some tomatoes for some carrots. And so they were able to do that. Did they just kick people out of the camps, or did they leave them time to relocate? They didn't. They left them time to help relocate, because some of the folks actually, believe it or not, some folks stayed in the camps for a whole year after the war was over because they had no place to go. Right? It's like, well, now I got no place to go. At least I've got something here. And so some of the folks were there for a whole year after the war until they, found new places to live and found new businesses and those sorts of things. Okay. So, the idea here is that there can be unintended consequences. The idea here is that sometimes we overreact when things happen. And we need to be very, very careful about our rights. We have to protect our rights. You have to protect your rights. And we have to look out for each other so that, we don't have these kinds of things occur. Generally speaking, the government's trying to help you. It's trying to look out for you. But sometimes it gets caught up in this hysteria and such. And this is what happened during the Second World War with the Japanese American incarceration. And it is a lesson that we have hopefully learned a few things from. Okay, let's see here. Did the Japanese Americans have cars? Generally not. There weren't really roads. Remember, I showed you the barracks. They were all like lined up close. So, you could walk around and those sorts of things. Plus, a lot of these camps, there was no place to get gas. Right, because they were just sort of thrown up in these parks and deserts and those sorts of things. Okay. All right, you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a little bit better understanding of the Japanese American incarceration. Also, keep in mind that usually when something happens, it doesn't just happen in isolation. It happens and it's been influenced by other things. So this certainly was influenced by the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. It goes down in history as something that is a blemish, right? It's a bad mark against President Roosevelt. Sometimes good people have bad things, right? Doesn't make them a bad person. It just makes it a bad thing. And we need to learn from that and hopefully not make that same mistake over.